Gemini, this weekend an evil will be broken in silence. Your life changes. I need you to pause for a moment and gently turn inward.
Breathe.
Listen, because what's unfolding this weekend is not just a cosmic shift, it's a soul-level unraveling of something that has quietly lingered in your life for far too long. It's subtle, perhaps even invisible to the outside world. But you've felt it, haven't you? The weight that never quite goes away. The thought that whispers when the world goes quiet. Why do I still feel held back? This isn't your imagination, and it's not weakness. It's an ancient, energetic imprint, an invisible thread that's been woven into your story since childhood. Something you inherited, endured, and unknowingly carried like a second skin. And now, without noise or drama, the universe is moving to lift this shadow. Silently, powerfully, completely. You don't need to force it. You only need to allow it. As a Gemini, your mind moves swiftly, dancing between thought and intuition. But this weekend, your healing will come not through analysis, but surrender. The silent force that held you down is breaking, and your life is about to shift in ways that will feel both profound and deeply personal. If this message resonates, even if just in a quiet corner of your heart, stay with me. And if you feel seen in these words, feel free to like, share, or subscribe. Your healing creates space for others to rise too. Let us begin this sacred unraveling together. Gate 1. The shadow you didn't know you carried. Gemini, one of the most misunderstood truths about your life is that not every burden you carry began with you. Some of the doubts that weigh you down, the patterns that repeat themselves no matter how hard you try to break free, the quiet fear that things will always somehow stay the same, these are not simply habits or quirks of personality. They are energetic inheritances, passed down through generations like unseen heirlooms. And you, dear Gemini, have carried them with grace, without even knowing it. You see, the twin nature of your sign often allows you to be both the observer and the experiencer. You can step outside of your feelings and examine them, but you can also drown inside them when they echo too closely to wounds you can't quite name. This weekend, that echo begins to quiet. And to truly feel the liberation that's coming, you must first understand the shadow you've unknowingly lived with. Let me tell you about Amelia, a Gemini woman I once guided. On the surface, her life looked polished. A confident speaker, a quick thinker, always the one who could lighten the mood or find a clever solution to a tough problem. But when we sat in silence during one of our first sessions, tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from exhaustion. She confessed something she'd never told anyone. Despite all her outward success, she felt as if she was constantly chasing something she could never quite reach. She described it as a glass wall between her and joy. She could see the light, even feel the warmth, but something always stopped her just before she arrived. She blamed herself, thinking perhaps she was too scattered, too indecisive, too restless. But the truth was more mysterious and far more powerful. What Amelia was carrying wasn't hers alone. Her mother had been abandoned young. Her grandmother had lived through a war that stripped her of safety and trust. The women before her had survived by shrinking, by silencing their truth, by learning to anticipate danger in even the most peaceful moments. And although Amelia had never experienced war or abandonment directly, the energy of survival was woven into the fabric of her body. Her nervous system was trained to flinch before anything new, to doubt before any risk, to retreat just before the breakthrough. She had inherited their fear without realizing it, and she wore it like armor.
This is not uncommon, Gemini.
Your body, your heart, your soul, they remember what even your conscious mind has forgotten. That moment you hesitated to speak in a meeting, not because you didn't know the answer, but because something inside you whispered, they won't take you seriously. The time you didn't follow through on a dream because that inner voice insisted, it's not safe to want too much. These aren't random moments of weakness. They are echoes of ancestral pain still vibrating within your field. And no amount of logic can explain them away. But here's the sacred news. These patterns, while inherited, are not permanent. You are not doomed to repeat what they did. You are the bridge, the one chosen to end what they had to endure. And this weekend, as cosmic energy converges in silence, a force greater than explanation is working to cut these threads, not violently, but gently, like silk being released from a tight knot. The first step is acknowledgement. Can you allow yourself to name the invisible weight without judgment? Can you say, "This didn't start with me, but I am the one who will finish it"? Because that is what true spiritual leadership looks like. It's not perfection. It's awareness. And it's willingness. You don't need to fix everything. You only need to be present with what is arising. That alone begins the unraveling. Amelia's healing didn't come through affirmations or mantras alone. It began when she finally admitted to herself that the shame she felt wasn't even hers. It was borrowed, passed down, rehearsed like a script she never wrote but always performed. When she said out loud, "I don't want to be afraid to shine anymore," something shifted. That week, a new opportunity came to her, one she would have previously avoided, thinking she wasn't ready. But this time, she said yes. Her voice trembled, but her spirit stood strong. And from that moment on, a chain was broken. You may not have Amelia's story, but you've likely felt the same haunting sense that you're living smaller than you were meant to. You've apologized for things you never did. You've made yourself the peacemaker, the easy one, the agreeable one, because somewhere deep inside, you were taught that being loud, angry, demanding, or even just boldly yourself would lead to disconnection. You were told, through words or silence, that to be loved, you had to be less. But that was never true. It was simply survival. Now, Gemini, you're safe enough to unlearn all of that. And that's what makes this weekend so sacred. The energetic forces at work are not just helping you break free. They are helping you remember who you were before the inheritance, before the conditioning, before the compromise. You are not too much. You are not broken. You are simply becoming who you always were beneath the fear. And when you let yourself feel the truth of that, even if only for a moment, a crack of light appears in the glass wall. That light isn't coming from outside of you. It's coming from you. This is the beginning of your release. This is where the invisible starts to unravel. Not with a bang, not with fanfare, but with breath, with awareness, with the decision to no longer carry what does not belong to you. And in that silence, Gemini, an old evil, an ancient blockage, is being broken not by effort, but by truth. Gate 2, letting go without closure, the quiet endings that heal you. Gemini, you've always been a seeker of clarity. You crave understanding, the full picture, the neatly tied conclusion that tells you why something ended, how it all fit together, and what it meant. But life doesn't always offer such kindness. Sometimes the doors that close behind you do so silently. No apology, no explanation, just the soft click of finality you weren't ready for. And yet, these are the endings that often hold the most powerful medicine. The truth is, not every chapter of your life was meant to end with a grand finale. Some needed to dissolve quietly so you wouldn't run back and try to save what was already meant to die. As a Gemini, your mind moves so fast that you often outrun your heart. You rationalize pain, talk yourself out of grief, or worse, pretend you never cared in the first place. But this weekend, something is shifting deep within you. A quiet ending is occurring, and this time, you're being asked not to analyze it, not to fix it, but to feel it, to let it close on its own terms. I once worked with a Gemini man named Leo, a writer and radio host, who had spent years trying to understand why his last serious relationship ended so abruptly. One day they were planning a life together, and the next, she had pulled away, offered no answers, no arguments, just silence. For years, Leo replayed conversations, scoured old texts, and even consulted astrologers looking for signs. What he couldn't accept was the silence itself. He wanted a reason, a villain,
A flaw.
anything but the gaping absence of meaning. But the absence was the meaning. When Leo finally allowed himself to stop asking why and instead asked, what now? Everything changed. He realized he had been holding space for someone who had already exited the room. And he was keeping himself in a limbo of half-healing. Once he let go of needing closure, He started writing again, not to process the pain, but to express the freedom that followed. The silence, it turns out, had been a sacred pause, not a punishment. Gemini, how many times have you delayed your own healing waiting for someone else to give you the permission to move on? How many people have you kept in your mental orbit long after they've stopped reaching for you? Your kind heart doesn't want to seem ungrateful or unkind. You believe in reconciliation, in understanding, in let's talk it out, but not every soul is meant to journey with you through every season. Some are meant to awaken you through their exit, not their presence. And you're allowed to grieve them without guilt. One of the hardest spiritual lessons is accepting that healing sometimes happens without answers. That's especially true for a sign like yours, ruled by Mercury, whose superpower is communication. But what do you do when there is nothing more to say? What happens when the other person simply goes quiet, when the job ends without notice, when the dream dissolves before it fully forms? You surrender. Because, Gemini, real transformation happens in the moment you choose you, even in the absence of clarity. The soul doesn't always need logic to know when something is complete. You've outgrown friendships you can no longer explain. You've stayed loyal to identities that no longer fit, simply because you didn't want to leave without a proper goodbye. But this weekend, your spirit is doing what your mind has resisted. It's letting go without permission. And as painful as that may sound, it is also freeing, because it teaches you that not everything unresolved is yours to fix. You are allowed to close the door. You are allowed to stop replying. You are allowed to take your energy back from anyone or anything that no longer honors it. That is not cruelty. That is healing. Think back, Gemini, how many quiet endings have you survived already? That friend you drifted from, but still think about. That version of you who wanted something so badly but couldn't make it happen. That chapter where you worked so hard for someone else's dream. You never got a thank you. You never got closure. And yet you survived. You moved forward. And now, as the universe breaks this ancient energetic cycle for you, it will ask one final thing. Will you let go without needing the story to make sense? Because the truth is, the ending itself is the wisdom. Leo, the writer I told you about, eventually met someone new, someone gentle, deeply spiritual, and emotionally available. But he told me something surprising. He said the best thing his ex ever gave him was the silence, because it taught him how to stop performing worthiness and start living it. He stopped seeking approval and began practicing self-trust. That was the real closure. Not a text, not a conversation, but the stillness that forced him to turn inward. And now, Gemini, that is exactly what this weekend offers you. An invisible hand removing the last threads of stories that were never yours to finish. You don't need their permission. You don't need the full picture. You just need to breathe through the space where they once lived in you and allow it to empty. That space is not a void. It's preparation. For new energy. For alignment.
For clarity.
The blessing of an unfinished ending is that it creates room for a future that isn't bound by old explanations. So if someone walks away, let them. If an old dream fades, bless it. If the goodbye you never got still echoes in your mind, whisper your own. Say, thank you for being a part of my becoming. I release you now. This is your quiet miracle, Gemini. The letting go that doesn't make headlines, but shifts your entire life. You don't have to scream. You don't have to plead. You only have to open. Because what's waiting for you is not behind you, in the explanation, in the memories, in the replays. It's ahead of you, in the silence that finally feels like peace. Gate 3. The return of soul truth, when the voice inside becomes louder than the world. There comes a moment in every Gemini's life, not loud, not public, but piercing in its intimacy, when the world grows too noisy and the inner voice, once ignored, begins to rise. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It simply insists. It insists that you remember who you are, beneath the personas, beneath the adaptability, beneath the roles you've played to keep peace, earn love, or avoid conflict. And when that voice begins to speak with clarity, something irreversible begins. The return to soul truth. You've spent much of your life learning how to blend in, Gemini. Your charm, intelligence, and agility have helped you adapt to every room you've entered. You've been the peacekeeper, the entertainer, the diplomat, the mind who could see both sides. But here's what no one tells you about being the one who always sees both sides. You begin to forget where your own side even is. You begin to lose track of your center. You start second-guessing what you actually believe, what you truly feel, because your focus is always on maintaining balance for others. But the soul cannot be silenced forever. A woman I once worked with, Elena, a Gemini and a therapist, shared something profound with me. She said, "Elizabeth, I've spent my whole life helping other people find their truth. And now I'm terrified to admit that I've lost touch with my own." Her voice trembled not from weakness, but from the courage it took to finally be honest. For decades, Elena had been the grounding presence for everyone else. She was the one you called during a breakup, the one who calmed family fights, the one who smiled through exhaustion. She never wanted to be a burden. She never wanted to be too much. But in choosing to be digestible, she had become invisible to herself. When Elena began listening, really listening, to the voice inside her, it didn't come as thunder. It came as questions, soft ones at first. What do I actually want? Is this version of me even real? And then came the clarity. She realized that so many of her choices had been compromises, not desires. That her boundaries weren't fences, but fog. That her life, though successful on the surface, was missing the one thing she had always given others, but never claimed for herself: authenticity. This weekend, Gemini, you are standing in the same threshold. You are being called back, not to a version of you the world expects, but to the self that existed before you were ever taught to be small. This return isn't flashy. There will be no announcement, no performance. But internally, it will feel seismic. Because when your inner truth finally becomes louder than the world around you, you'll begin to live differently. You will speak differently. You will love differently. Not from a place of pleasing, but from presence. And this isn't about rebellion or abandoning everyone around you. It's not about becoming hard or cold. No, in fact, it's the opposite. You'll be warmer,
Softer.
but rooted. Because the voice you're listening to now isn't reactive, it's ancient. It's the voice that existed before the conditioning, before the people-pleasing, before the fear of being misunderstood. It's the voice that remembers your purpose. And when you align with it, you stop needing everyone else's permission. You'll start to notice it in small ways. You'll say no without over-explaining. You'll pause before saying yes just to fill space. You'll dress for how you want to feel, not for the image others expect. You'll stop laughing at things that don't feel funny, stop attending things that drain you, stop apologizing for taking up space. It may feel unnatural at first. That's okay. You've been conditioned to shrink. But what once felt natural was just familiar, not true. Gemini, the world has always loved your lightness, your wit, your ability to make heavy things feel lighter. But your true gift is not just in your sparkle, it's in your depth. And this weekend, that depth is returning. You'll feel it in your bones, in the way your breath slows when you're alone, in the way your chest softens when you're no longer trying to prove anything. This isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering what's whole. When Elena finally honored her inner voice, she didn't burn her life down. She made subtle shifts. She started speaking slower. She made space between questions and answers. She said things like, "I'm not sure yet, but I'll sit with it." Her friends were surprised. Some drifted. Some drew closer. But she noticed that the clients who resonated with her healing began arriving in waves, people ready not just for advice, but for depth. Her truth attracted resonance, not because she chased it, but because she embodied it. And that's the invitation for you, Gemini, to no longer chase truth, but to become it. Not the polished version, the real one. The messy, radiant, unfiltered version of you who doesn't bend to be loved but allows love to find her as she is. You'll start to see the world respond differently. People will pause around you, not out of confusion, but reverence. Your presence will start speaking before your words. And the people who once drained you will begin to fall away, Not because you rejected them, but because you finally accepted yourself. You don't need to fight for your voice anymore. You only need to return to it. So when the old self whispers, "They'll leave if you change," remind her. Then they were never meant to stay. When the doubt says, "It's safer to be small," answer, "But I was born to expand." When fear knocks, don't slam the door. Just smile and say, "I remember who I am now." You no longer lead. This is the sacred return, Gemini. And it's happening now, not in theory, not in some distant future, but in the stillness between one breath and the next. This weekend, the voice you once buried beneath noise, obligation, and fear is becoming your compass. Listen.
Honor. Trust.
Because once you align with that voice, the world around you will shift to match its frequency. And that shift is not only inevitable, it's divine. Gate 4. The quiet breaking, when inner peace shatters the final chain. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty. It hums with power. It doesn't scream, it doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything it touches. This weekend, Gemini, that silence is surrounding you, not as a void, but as a holy presence. It comes not to destroy, but to dissolve. It's not a war cry, it's a whisper that breaks curses. And what it's dissolving is the final chain you've carried for far too long, the unconscious belief that peace must be earned through suffering. You've grown up believing that struggle precedes worth, that love must be proven, that rest must be justified. Even when your heart longed for quiet, your mind insisted it was lazy. Even when your body asked for space, your guilt called it selfish. For years, you've kept running, not because there was somewhere you had to go, but because you didn't know how to stand still without shame creeping in. Stillness felt unsafe. Because somewhere along the line, you were taught that stillness meant abandonment, silence meant disconnection, and ease meant weakness. But this weekend is sacred not because of anything you do, but because of what you finally stopped doing. You stop explaining yourself to people who never truly listened. You stop negotiating your worth with those who only loved versions of you that serve them. You stop trying to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you. And most of all, you stop apologizing for your existence. When a Gemini breaks free, it doesn't look like fire. It looks like stillness. It looks like a room no longer filled with overthinking. It looks like saying no without fear. Like choosing solitude over performance. Like taking up space in your own life again. You've tried the loud routes before. You've tried proving, pleasing, outperforming. But this liberation? It comes with quiet steps. The kind that echo only inside your spirit. Let me share a story. There's a client of mine, a Gemini man named Tobias, who spent his whole adult life being the reliable one. He was the guy everyone counted on, emotionally, financially, mentally. He worked 70-hour weeks, maintained perfect politeness, hosted family dinners, remembered everyone's birthdays. But inside, he was exhausted. His quiet joy, the guitar he loved, the poetry he used to write, the long silent walks, had all vanished, swallowed by responsibility. When he came to me, he didn't say, "I'm in crisis." He said, "I'm numb." And that was far scarier. We worked together not to add more action, but to unlearn noise. He started waking up early, not to rush into tasks, but to sit by his window with coffee and no phone. He stopped answering messages immediately. He started choosing peace over obligation. And the biggest shift? One day, he looked at me and said, "For the first time, I feel like I'm not performing life. I'm actually living it." Gemini, that is what awaits you now. This weekend marks a sacred unraveling, not of your life, but of the old laws you've lived under. The ones that said, your softness must be earned. Love is conditional. Rest must be productive. Silence means something's wrong. None of that is true. Peace is not the reward for burning out. It's the birthright you've forgotten. And now that you remember it, the chains no longer hold. You may feel subtle shifts before you notice dramatic ones. Perhaps your breath deepens while walking alone. Perhaps a conversation that would have once drained you now ends quickly, with no guilt. Perhaps a phone call rings and your spirit says, Not now, and for once you listen. These are signs. These are sacred. You're not being cold, you're being clear. And from clarity, a new kind of love begins. Not the kind you fight for, plead for, perform for, but the kind that meets you in stillness, respects your quiet, and doesn't punish your boundaries. This is the love your soul was always meant to receive. But it couldn't find you through the noise. It couldn't see you when you were hiding in accommodation. This new love may come from others, yes. A friend, a partner, a stranger whose energy feels like home. But more than that, it begins inside. It is self-tending. It is gentle choices. It is silence that nourishes. You may cry when it arrives, not because you're sad, but because you finally feel safe. This is the breaking that matters. Not the dramatic collapse, but the gentle undoing of lies. The breaking of toxic cycles. The shattering of inherited fear. The quiet ending of a contract you never signed, but kept living anyway. One that said, "Stay small and you'll be loved." That lie ends now. The world may not notice at first, but you will. You'll feel different in your skin. You'll feel less rushed, less reactive, more present, more free. It's like walking through the same streets but seeing different skies. The external may remain the same for a while, but the internal is new. And from that newness, everything will shift. Don't worry if others don't understand. They're not meant to. Not everyone can recognize a quiet revolution. Some only respond to fire. But the most powerful transformations often happen in the dark, between heartbeats, beneath the noise. So, honor it, Gemini. Turn down the volume of the world and tune into yourself. Sit with this peace. Let it take root. You don't need to prove your growth. Your energy will speak louder than words. And those meant for you will feel it. The chain is broken. The silence is holy. And your new life begins. Not with a bang, but with breath. Conclusion: the return to your true self. Gemini, breathe this in. You are not becoming someone else. You are returning to yourself. This weekend was never about fixing what was broken. It was about releasing what was never yours to carry. The pain, the silence, the invisible contracts, the inherited doubt. All of it served a purpose. All of it shaped your strength. But none of it defines your future. You've just walked through a quiet rebirth. Not loud, not public, but sacred. The kind of rebirth that only your soul could truly feel. And in doing so, you've activated something profound. The ability to choose peace without guilt, to live without apology, and to feel deeply without fear. Let's take a moment to honor the journey. You confronted the shadow you couldn't name. You listened when your body whispered, "Rest." You said no without flinching. You remembered your own light. That, my dear Gemini, is courage. Now the world will respond. Not because you demanded it, but because you aligned. Energetic doors will open. The right people will arrive. Not because you chased them, but because you became a match for them. And most importantly, you will begin to show up for yourself in ways you never thought possible. So what comes next? Stay in your truth. Keep honoring your stillness. Don't rush to fill the space that just opened inside you. Let it breathe. Let it expand. Let it call in only what is sacred, mutual, and meant. If this message stirred something within you, I invite you to like, share, or subscribe to this channel, Esoteric Wisdom. Not out of obligation, but as a way to claim this transformation and continue this journey together. You are ready. You are aligned. And most of all, you are free.